We're beginning Chapter 12, Saudi Cover. Within minutes after Mohomed Atta's name was identified as the main suspect in the 9/11 attack, reporters began digging through newspaper archives for anything that might have been printed about him in the past. What turned up was reflected in a question on the morning after the attack that Jane Clayson of the CBS Early Show asked of Rudy Deckers, the Huffman Aviation co-owner, then in the midst of his whirlwind round of media appearances. "Let me ask you this," Clayson began. "One of these men is widely considered to be responsible for a bus bombing in Israel. How was it that they could gain admittance to your school?" Authorities immediately denied that the Mohomed Atta who masterminded the demolition of the World Trade Center was the same Mohomed Atta who, 15 years earlier, had blown up an Israeli bus. There were two separate Arab terrorists named Mohomed Atta, they said, one who bombed a bus in 1986 and a second who flew a commercial airliner into the World Trade Center towers. We found a May 21st, 1987 story from Damascus on the Chinese Xinhua Overseas News Service with a headline reading, "Syria accuses U.S. of deteriorating bilateral relations." Abu Nidal, head of the Fatah Revolutionary Committee of the Palestine Liberation Organization, threatened to sabotage American interests all over the world if Washington decided to hand over Mohomed Atta, a Palestinian arrested in New York, to the Israeli authorities on trial for murdering a bus driver in Israel. The context was a recently announced U.S. decision not to send back its ambassador to Damascus unless Syria's Hafez Assad took steps first to provide that his government was no longer supporting terrorism. American accusations of Syrian support for terrorists were baseless. Or terrorism. American accusations of Syrian support for terrorism were baseless, declared the Xinhua report. La plus to change. Future terrorist ringleader Atta was 18 at the time of the bus bombing, an age when young youthful idealism is often perverted into violence. But a quick search through newspaper indexes revealed that the bus bomber Mohomed Atta, also known as Mahmoud Atta, was indeed much older, 33 in 86. He'd be 50-ish today. Mohomed Atta, 33, charged in the firebombings of a crowded bus on Israel's occupied West Bank on April 12, 1986, that killed one civilian and injured 3 others, was held Thursday without bail until the policy issues can be addressed. UPI reported on May 8, 1987. That seemed to settle the question. Bus bomber Atta is a much older man than the terrorist hijacker. Smoke, no fire, it happens. By pursuing the story, we'd gained a little incidental knowledge. Mohomed is another was of saying Muhammad the same way men named John are sometimes called Jack. Interestingly, bus bomber Atta felt there was some confusion as to his identity. Atta, also known as Mahmoud El Abed Ahmad, claims he is not the person authorities were looking for, UPI reported. So at a minimum, we have 2 Arab radicals with the same admittedly not uncommon name. Probably just coincidence, unless the name Mohomed Atta was used by numbers of Arab terrorists. Bus bomber Atta's globe-trotting ways were also eerily similar to terrorist hijacker Atta's prepetic movements. Newspaper accounts said the bus bomber fled to Israel. Wait. Newspaper accounts said the bus bomber fled from Israel to Athens and then on to Venezuela, where he was arrested. When he arrived at JFK Airport after flying from Caracas, accompanied by FBI agents, the U.S. prosecutor in the case said Atta's passport showed numerous trips around the globe. Terrorist pilot Atta got around a lot too. Prague, Madrid, Miami, Manhattan. Maybe being a spy hadn't changed that much. But there's something big and important to understand. 9/11 here. Because there had been a bus bomber, Mohomed Atta. The name Mohomed Atta was on a special FBI CIA federal watch list, which should have red flagged the terrorist ringleader to authorities on numerous occasions. In fact, an NBC reporter the day after the attack attributed the FBI's quick zeroing in on Atta to the simple fact that they already knew who he was. They'd seen his name before, linked, said NBC's Kerry Sanders, to the bus bombing in Israel. Agents were in Hollywood, Florida, serving search warrants inside an apartment complex, Sanders reported. They left with several boxes of evidence. The attention was really focusing on one person, Mohomed Atta, 33 years old, somebody who they know, because they've seen his name before, linked to a bombing of a bus in Israel in 1986. Atta, 33, was born in the United Arab Emirates, was listed as a suspect in a bus bombing in Israel in 1986 that landed him on a CIA, FBI, Immigration and Naturalization Service watch list, reported NBC's Sanders. Here's the big question. If the name Mohomed Atta was on a federal watch list of people tied to terrorist activity because of bus bomber Atta, why didn't this fact get hijacker Atta's ass caught before the attack? Were they that incompetent? NBC anchor Brian Williams, he of the oft-remarked unnatural tan, gave voice to it first, the night after the attack. There will be many people asking tonight, he said, right over the public airwaves, just what is it we are getting for all those tens of billions of dollars being spent on intelligence? Could that be it? Simple incompetence? Why didn't they catch Atta if he was running in and out of the country with a notorious name? They had ample opportunity. For example, the terrorist ringleader had police on his tail late on the night of April 26th in Broward County, Florida. Red and blue flashing lights and a police siren beckoned him to pull over. Atta pulled his red Grand Am to the curb and was arrested during the traffic stop for not having a driver's license, but he easily bailed out and drove away. Street cops aren't looking for international terrorists during routine traffic stops. Not before 9/11 they weren't anyway. But what explains the fact that Atta was able to fly from Miami to Madrid and back with no hassles, despite the fact that he had overstayed his visa? At least one of the Boston hijackers, Mohomed Atta, was able to enter the United States despite having been implicated in a 1986 bus bombing in Israel, according to federal sources, the Boston Globe reported 3 days after the attack. Officials said Atta's name was on a federal watch list, yet the INS remitted him with no problem upon his return to the U.S. Simple incompetence or something much more sinister? In interviews with the Globe yesterday, flight instructors in Florida said that it was common for students with Saudi affiliations to enter the United States with only cursory background checks and sometimes none. Aha, gotcha. Students with Saudi affiliations. This was new, or new to us. Students with Saudi affiliations were accorded special treatment in Florida, said flight instructors there, that allowed them to enter and leave the U.S. more easily. Saudis were getting special treatment in Florida from our government. That much seemed clear, even though we weren't sure we had a working definition yet of what special treatment meant. And it wasn't just Saudis who got special treatment, reported the Globe, but students with Saudi affiliations as well. Saudis had a lot of juice in Florida. Chuck Clapper, owner of an air charter company in Atta, Florida, told the Globe that several Florida flying schools had contracts with Saudi Arabian Airlines that enable them to bypass much of the red tape involved in obtaining visas for their students. Saudi Arabia had authority to pass through anyone they wanted. They didn't even need to be Saudi. They just needed Saudi affiliations. The Saudi cover may have enabled one of the dead hijackers, Mohomed Atta, to deflect attention from the fact that he was wanted in Israel in connection with a bus bombing in 1986, the paper reported. The Saudi cover, it sounded like the title of a Robert Ludlum novel. Because he had Saudi cover, Atta got special treatment in Florida. Atta's passing himself off as a Saudi prince made more sense. Indeed, the benefit of having Saudi cover goes back some time. The former head of the American Visa Bureau in Jeddah from 1987 to 1989, Michael Springman, told BBC Newsnight, "In Saudi Arabia, I was repeatedly ordered by high-level State Department officials to issue visas to unqualified applicants, people who had no ties either to Saudi Arabia or to their own country. I accompanied here in Washington, to the Inspector General and to diplomatic security, and I was ignored. What I was doing was giving visas to terrorists recruited by the CIA and Osama bin Laden to come back to the United States for training to be used in the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets." Forced to give visas to terrorists sounds like a good headline. Too bad we'll never see it. It pretty much encapsulates American diplomat Springman's story. Was it a method still in use to bring Saudi-affiliated individuals into the U.S. when Atta arrived? When Atta arrived a dozen years later, were special people still getting in and out of the U.S. this way? In passing, it should be noted that Atta was a bus bomber story was also twisted and used in some pretty sophisticated disinformation. When a broadly based email campaign started fingering Tar Baby Bill Clinton for being responsible for releasing Mohomed Atta from jail, the Oslo Agreement between the Palestinians and Israel had required release of so-called political prisoners, explained the disinfo. However, the Israelis would not release any with blood on their hands. That's where that dastardly Clinton comes in. As American president, he supposedly insisted that all prisoners be released, even those with blood on their hands. Some people thought it sounded like our bill. At any rate, Atta was freed and came back to thank the U.S. by flying an airplane into Tower 1 of the World Trade Center. There was not a shred of truth to the story, but it obviously took someone some little time and effort to first package the lie so cleverly and then disseminate it widely during a confusing and uncertain moment in our national life when news accounts actually said that U.S. intelligence agencies were recruiting psychics to help predict future attacks. The FBI and CIA refused to comment, except to confirm investigators that had been told to think outside the box. The national mood was dicey, enough to warrant the Washington Post to gushingly report that the FBI, after decades of pursuing gangsters and drug kingpins to great acclaim, was rushing to remake itself as the nation's primary line of defense against terrorism. Great acclaim was a little rich. Decades of great acclaims is rich enough to give the flack who wrote it gout. The only acclaim for the FBI we'd heard came from those who want to see it abolished for a long sordid history distinguished by scandal, incompetence, and worse. Sometimes much worse. Remember, Atta, 33, an Egyptian, was on the FBI's master list of suspected Arab terrorists, specifically as a possible operative of bin Laden, reported the September 13, 2001 London Daily Telegraph. Federal authorities have known for at least 3 years that 2 associates of bin Laden had trained in the United States as airline pilots, reported the Boston Globe, citing an FBI memo dated May 18, 1998. The Globe doesn't say why the FBI did nothing about it, neither does the memo, we'll wager. Not since the days of J. Edgar Hoover and Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. have the American people believed much in this particular federal institution. Congress has rumbled with murmurs that it is beyond reform and should be abolished, all of which makes it all the more puzzling when the FBI turned up Johnny on the spot at Huffman on the day of the attack. After spending decades not being able to find their ass in the dark with both hands, the beleaguered FBI shows up at Huffman Aviation in Venice less than 18 hours after the attack. It usually takes them that long to have lunch. This is one of the most remarkable facts about 9/11. Remarkable in the sense that it should receive close scrutiny. It looks like the FBI already knew who he was, as well as where he was, or would have been. If he hadn't vaporized himself and thousands of others, they had known who Atta was. Here's a newsflash. The FBI got to Venice a lot sooner than has been reported. Instead of piling out of cars during the middle of the night 18 hours after the attack, they had Huffman Aviation employees in Venice under surveillance just a few hours later. A former Huffman Aviation manager told of a car filled with FBI agents pulling up and parking right outside his house during the middle of the afternoon on the day of the attack. They, the FBI, were outside of my house for hours after the attack, this still-shaken aviation professional stated. Like many eyewitnesses we spoke with, this longtime aviation executive spoke of being intimidated and harassed by FBI agents. They didn't strong-arm him to make him think harder and cough up some useful leads, but to ensure he kept his mouth shut. We've heard about this already from other people too, haven't we? It's becoming a refrain. Hide the children, honey. Here comes the guy in Florsheim shoes bouncing a sap off his thigh again. My bones haven't been bugged. They still are. Oh, my bones. My phones have been bugged. They still are. The former Huffman executive said, I thought these guys, Atta and co., were double agents. Why is this so incriminating? Double agents. He said it. We had wondered as much ourselves. He said no more except to indicate that he has lived in some fear for his life since the 9/11 attacks, which is why he'd be very obliged if we didn't use his name. I gleaned early on that the operation I was working for had government protection, the Huffman executive stated. They, the terrorists, were led into this country. How did the FBI get here so soon? Ask yourself. How did they get here so soon? Led into this country. By whom? To do what? Later, we learned of a conversation this former Huffman executive, who was at the school the whole time Atta was, had with another aviation executive at the Venice airport, who had asked him why he quit working for Rudy. His response was a little frightening. I had to leave and get out, said the former Huffman executive. I wish I didn't know as much as I know. I told them they had nothing to fear from me. I had a contract to get paid and expected them to pay me. Asked why he stopped cooperating with our Venice investigation, he stopped talking to us just after a few conversations, he said. I've got a family to worry about. The aviation executive he was talking to The aviation executive he was talking to operates a maintenance facility right next door to Huffman, so he was naturally curious. What was going on at Huffman that made it so difficult to talk about now? You don't want to know, replied Decker's former manager. I've got a family. You've got a family. My wife doesn't want to know any of this stuff. And if you're smart, you'll do the same. Whoa now. We haven't heard any voices like that on Larry King Live. At the time of this conversation, we'd been poking around in Venice for a year. It wasn't long enough to have figured things out much, but it was apparently long enough to have warranted mention at the airport. He made it crystal clear that Hopsicker knows far more than he thought he knew, a second aviation executive told us. He said, I know more about Wally Hillard than I want to know, but I can't talk to Hopsicker anymore. I can't do that to my family. Maybe this is why, or partly, the FBI knew terrorists were using flight schools, headlined the Washington Post on September 23, 2001. The FBI has been aware of 4 or 5 groups linked to Osama bin Laden have operated in the United States and known for years that suspected terrorists with ties to Osama bin Laden were receiving flight training at schools in the United States, the paper reported. The federal authorities have been aware for years that suspected terrorists with ties to Osama bin Laden were receiving flight training at schools in the United States and abroad, according to interviews and court testimony. A senior government official acknowledged to the Post that law enforcement officials were aware that fewer than a dozen people with links to bin Laden had attended U.S. flight schools, the paper said. However, the officials said there was no information to indicate the flight students had been planning suicide hijacking attacks. Here's a more important question. If the FBI knew that a dozen al-Qaeda terrorists were attending U.S. flight schools, why didn't they do anything about it? The Saudi cover? The explanation was growing increasingly plausible. Saudis have been running loose in Florida. We will soon hear, privileged and protected. Some make it sound as if somebody sold the Sunshine State to the Saudis. From Amanda Keller, we learned that even if Atta wasn't a Saudi prince, he had a big Saudi connection. They were having an argument about religion one day, she said, provoked by a comment that Islamic customs like stoning were barbaric. Atta extolled some of the virtues of Islamic life as he saw it. Mohomed said, "You American people are so stupid. You think you're so great and powerful, but you wouldn't even know if something was happening." I said, "Please, you people are over there killing each other for no damn good reason," Amanda told us. What makes you think you are so fucking great? What are you fighting over? It's just ignorant. And he got mad at me because I told him ignorance wasn't bliss. I said, you treat your women like shit. And he said that's how women were meant to be treated. And I'm like, oh really? Even as she talked, we thought. Yeah. We would have paid to watch this scene play out. He would make fun of how we believe in God, she stated. He said, what do people do for your God? You don't do anything for him. And I just looked at him. He was talking to me about how American women are free to choose abortions if they want. Like that was immoral. And I said, you guys stone people to death if they get pregnant and they're not married. I said, you want to talk about barbaric? That's barbaric. Stoning somebody to death. What does that accomplish? You guys are so damn crooked that you would stab your brother in the back and not think anything about it. He said, you don't know what you're talking about, she continued. Atta told her there were many rich people who funded what he did. He said that there was someone in Florida, some rich Arab, who had a lot of money, he said. Are you aware that when we come over here, your people pay to have us set up businesses? Eventually, he told me, his people were going to try to take over this country, he said. I've been in this country many times before. I can come in and go out of America and no one ever knows. This is a side of Atta we haven't seen before. Arrogant, but with a reason. He's not an infidel. He's styling. He's got Saudi cover. Atta wasn't the only one in Venice with Saudi cover. He had friends at Huffman who were covered too. Saudi links to the owners of Huffman Aviation began to be uncovered shortly after the attack. In a story in the Tampa Tribune about bin Laden family members in the U.S. flying out of the country while all other aviation except military traffic had been grounded. The twin-engine Learjet streaked into the afternoon sky, leaving Tampa behind but revealing a glimpse of international intrigue in the aftermath of terrorist attacks on America, the paper reported. The federal government says the flight never took place, but the two armed bodyguards hired to chaperone their clients out of the state recalled the 100-minute trip September 13th quite vividly. The paper's headline was Phantom Flight from Florida, maybe because the federal government says the flight never took place. It carried a Saudi Arabian prince, the son of the nation's defense minister, as well as the son of a Saudi army commander, from Tampa to Lexington, Kentucky, where other Saudi princes had been purchasing racehorses in bluegrass country. From there, they flew a private 747 out of the country. A spokesman for the Federal Aviation Administration's regional office in Atlanta told reporters, It's not in our logs. It didn't occur. No one in the government would acknowledge to the Tampa Tribune what had happened. The White House referred questions on the trip to the State Department, which denied involvement, the paper reported, and the National Security Council, which did not return messages. Was that why the FBI left the operation alone? A longtime Florida observer told us bluntly that what we were dealing with was market forces. It was the climate of intrigue created by the commodities that were being traded on Florida's overactive black market that created conditions which allowed Arabs from desert kingdoms to wander around the state as easily as if they'd been listening to Tom Petty albums all their lives. What commodities? What black market? What had been going on that we were missing down in Venice, Florida. As they say in TV land, let's take a closer look. And that's it for Chapter 12. Chapter 13, Evil in Our Own Backyard. Tomorrow or some other time.